This is a very important conference because its underlying theme is the need for downright intellectual and moral clarity in the fight against terror. Terror is a crime, and in all legal systems I know of, incitement to a crime is itself a criminal offense. Therefore, one should think that criminalizing incitement to terror by an international convention should receive broad support within the community of nations. This, however, might prove difficult. Very roughly speaking, I presume one may divide the camp of opponents in two categories. The first category consists of states that sponsor terrorism and of states where certain forms of hate speech, from Holocaust denial to incendiary propaganda, are seen as acceptable or even true statements. As these states are not represented here today, I will immediately turn to the second category. This category consists of states where a libertarian public opinion is averse to regulations that look like an infringement on free speech. In his introduction to the draft International Convention for the Prevention of Incitement to Terror, Ambassador Alan Baker puts it this way, I quote, "Constitutional provisions for freedom of speech in national legislation have restricted serious discussion of prohibiting or criminalizing incitement to terror through some form of international instrument," unquote. As a former representative to the German Federal Council, the legislative body through which the German federal states participate in our national legislation, I can confirm that this is an accurate description of the objections the anti-incitement project will face in my country, as well as in many other European societies. Of course, I'm not advocating defeatism. What I mean to say is that one has to know these objections in order to be able to counter them. The example I'm referring to from my own experience is the so-called Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, a treaty which was elaborated under the aegis of the Strasbourg-based Council of Europe and opened for signature in 2001. It was also signed by the non-European countries Canada, Japan, South Africa, and the United States, and it entered into force in 2004. Summarizing the London Conference on Cyberspace last week, the British Foreign Secretary William Hague came out in favor of further expanding support for the Budapest Convention beyond the sphere of Council of Europe member states. In 2003, the Budapest Convention was complemented by an additional protocol concerning the criminalization of acts of a racist and xenophobic nature committed through computer systems, which came into force in 2006. The additional protocol defines as racist and xenophobic material any written material, any image, or any other representation of ideas or theories which advocates, promotes, or incites hatred, discrimination, or violence against any individual or group of individuals based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, as well as religion, if used as a pretext for any of these factors. It bans the dissemination of racist and xenophobic material through computer systems, racist and xenophobic motivated threat and insult, as well as denial, gross minimization, approval, or justification of genocide or crimes against humanity. When the Budapest Convention and the additional protocol were to be ratified by the German Federal Parliament and the German Federal Council, both instruments were criticized on the ground that some of their regulations were giving too much power to security authorities at the expense of citizens' freedom. I do believe that the Big Brother argument has to be taken seriously. In countries without a strong liberal and democratic tradition, there is a clear danger that internet regulation is and will be used as a gateway to surveillance and censorship. But I also believe the rule of law does not stop at the entrance to cyberspace, as radical internet libertarians would have it. The opposite is true. That behavior that is unacceptable offline is also unacceptable online. You may justify that statement by quoting one of the fathers of modern libertarianism, John Stuart Mill. In his book On Liberty, published in 1859, he articulated what became known as the harm principle. It says that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others, unquote. And there can be no doubt that incitement to terror is harming others, for it is more than a mere expression of opinion. It is a willful action that aims to injure and kill human beings. I admit that it can be very difficult to draw a clear demarcation line between hate speech and incitement. This is a debate we had in Europe after the Norwegian right-wing extremist Anders Behring Breivik had killed 77 people in a bombing and shooting rampage in July this year. Breivik describes his militant ideology in a compendium of texts titled 2083, A European Declaration of Independence, which he distributed electronically on the day of the attacks. His manifesto is, among other things, stuffed with anti-Muslim propaganda he had compiled from different internet sources. Apart from John Stuart Mill, there is another liberal philosopher with whom I would like to rest my case, Karl Raimund Popper. In his seminal work, The Open Society and Its Enemies, written during World War II, Popper deals with what he calls the paradox of tolerance. I think Popper is the most convincing crown witness. He had no illusions about the rise of Nazism and the threat of the Anschluss, and he emigrated from Austria to New Zealand in 1937. Let me quote him in full length. Unlimited tolerance must lead to the disappearance of tolerance. If we extend unlimited tolerance even to those who are intolerant, we are not prepared to defend a tolerant society against the onslaught of the intolerant. Then the tolerant will be destroyed, and tolerance with them. In this formulation, says Popper, I do not imply, for instance, that we should always suppress the utterance of intolerant philosophies. As long as we can counter them by rational argument and keep them in check by public opinion, suppression would certainly be unwise. But we should claim the right to suppress them if necessary, even by force, for it may easily turn out that they are not prepared to meet us on the level of rational argument, but begin by denouncing all argument. They may forbid their followers to listen to rational argument because it is deceptive, and teach them to answer arguments by the use of their fists or pistols. We should therefore claim, in the name of tolerance, the right not to tolerate the intolerant. We should claim that any movement preaching intolerance places itself outside the law, and we should consider incitement to intolerance and persecution as criminal, in the same way as we should consider incitement to murder or to kidnapping or to the revival of the slave trade as criminal. End of quote. One last remark. Incitement to terror is the symptom of a severe intellectual and moral illness, which means that combating incitement is not enough. I'm not an expert, and I cannot offer you an explanation of that illness. This is why the following remarks represent a purely personal view. I've been in Israel for 5 months now, and I'm full of admiration for what has been achieved here, in the economic sphere, in cultural life, in scientific research, and in many other fields. I can see a vibrant, liberal democracy where no one, not even the president, is above the law, and where everyone is enjoying the right to raise their voice against injustices and whatever they think has gone wrong. Israel is by far the most successful country in the Middle East, and that seems to arouse strong feelings of envy among its less successful neighbors. In July this year, the Washington-based Pew Research Center published the results of its International Public Opinion Survey on Muslim-Western relations. What struck me most is that 53% of Muslim publics blame American and Western policies for the lack of prosperity in their countries, while only 49% identify government corruption and only 42% lack of democracy as the main causes of domestic failure. Ladies and gentlemen, I presume I'm less pessimistic about the Arab Spring than public opinion in Israel seems to be. I'm convinced the Arab Spring can be the beginning of a success story if the Muslim publics abandon self-pity. Self-criticism instead of self-pity is the key to success. Democracy means that there is no excuse. You have a choice. You get the government you deserve. So stop blaming others, the Zionists, the Americans, the West, you name it. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe there is a long way to go until a convention against incitement to terror will enter into force, especially in those countries where such provisions are badly needed. But I also believe it is worth the effort, and I'm glad to be involved in that effort.